pleasure to be here, even as a bad guy. I'm pleased to join the panel and to help start the conversation tonight. Nazicott and I co-authored the historian's brief in the Goodrich case, and I'd like to use that experience to talk about the role of professional historians as contributors to legal policy generally, and to the debate about same-sex marriage in particular. We're also charged with particular kinds of tasks as this panel tonight, and one of my first tasks is to talk a little bit about the basic medium that historians have chosen to use to engage in this debate, and that's the amicus brief. And so, I don't want to turn this into Law 101, but just a little bit here. With the basics, an amicus curiae brief, a friend of the court brief, is submitted by an expert, and the goal is to deepen the understanding of a case by providing judges with legal, or social, or political, or scientific information. It's basically a role of being a friend of the court to offer a perspective to the court that it wouldn't otherwise have. But these are not neutral presentations. These are briefs of advocacy to support one of the parties in the case. And so all of these briefs that we talk about are part of that process as well. I do think, as a historian, I cannot help but tell you that there has also been changes in the use of amicus brief over the years. At the start of the 20th century, only about 10% of cases had amicus briefs. By the end of the century, 85% of cases had amicus briefs. And so it's been transformed into a very different kind of part of the legal process. So there's been a transformation from what was rare to what was common, from what was marginal to what was influential. And so that, at least for me, at the start of this, begs a bit of a question as to why. Part of the answer is that courts have been more receptive to it. But I think there's a larger force at work, too. That's one of the first points I'd like to make as part of our conversation. And that, it seems to me, is part of what I would call the dilemma of legal expertise. And by that, I mean to ask a question. Who do and who should the courts listen to in the debates over major questions like same-sex marriage? The obvious answer, of course, is that they should listen to judges and lawyers. But what we've learned in the past is that Americans have never been fully satisfied by that answer. And we've learned that again in same-sex marriage cases. We learned that in California with Proposition 8. Over and over again, as that shows us, numbers of people have refused to accept the legitimacy of judicial decisions on critical issues like same-sex marriage, or abortion, or end-of-life questions, or particularly a number of critical family law issues. It's part of, I think, a larger reality that we have always considered law far too important to be left to the lawyers. As a legal historian, I now have to play my card. I have to quote Tocqueville. If I don't quote Tocqueville, they'll take away my card. So Tocqueville said, law is a vulgar tongue. And what he meant by that is that it's a common language we all use, and we use it to try and influence the courts in part. There is a clear and yet incredibly uncertain role of public opinion on the courts. We know it's there. It's very hard to measure. One of the things it tells us is that judges have always listened to people outside the legal world. And it's that reality that I think is part of the process that we need to understand. It seems to me that fact took a decisive turn in 1908 with future Justice Louis Brandeis. As many of you know, he was asked to take on Mueller versus Oregon. That dealt with an Oregon statute that regulated the working hours of women. Constitutionally, it was very uncertain that he could convince the court to support that statute. And so what he did, as you may know, is that he created what comes to be called the Brandeis Brief. He had 3 pages about law and 75 pages filled with empirical data purporting to prove that men and women were different and that that difference warranted protective legislation for women. Brandeis not only won the case, but it seems to me he established a role for social and behavioral sciences as a source of information in the law. I think it represented an epistemological change in legal argument and legal evidence. And so what it did was to spur the expanding use of social science and later humanities research in litigation and appeals, and a broadening notion of who is an expert and what is expertise. But it also raised what has become a persistent question: which experts should intervene in the legal process? How should they intervene? Part of the answer is that more and more should intervene. That's part of the growth of these briefs. And yet the dilemma, it seems to me, remains: who do we listen to? Who do we heed in legal context? Who's an expert? And that leads me to the second topic I'd like to talk about. That is the entrance of historians into the role of brief writers. That's how I got involved